The rifle hit the table hard enough to make the cups rattle, and every alien officer in the room turned to look at it like it was something that had crawled out of the mud. "This is what you carry?" High Marshal Threll Voss picked it up between two long fingers, holding it away from his body, as if it might leak something on his uniform. A tube, a spring, metal pellets. My youngest hatchling could build something more dangerous with parts from a broken transport. I did not answer right away. My name is Nora Fenwick, and I had been standing in that briefing hall for 6 minutes, listening to a room full of Velkari officers take turns making jokes about my rifle. It was an old design, built on Earth decades before I was born, passed down through my family and rebuilt more times than I could count. The stock was scratched. The metal had a dull shine instead of the glossy finish their weapons had. Next to their sleek energy rifles, humming faintly with blue light along the barrels, mine looked like something from a museum. "It still works," I said. Threll Voss laughed, and the sound was sharp, almost like glass breaking. The other officers laughed with him, the way people do when they want to please someone in charge. Colonel Grant Ashby, the ranking human on the outpost, stood near the back of the room with his arms crossed, saying nothing. He had learned a long time ago that arguing with the Velkari about weapons was a losing fight. They had ships that could cross a solar system in a week. They had armor that could shrug off small explosions. They had energy weapons that could cut through steel plating like it was paper. Compared to that, a rifle that fired metal slugs using a spring and a hammer looked like a toy. "Fenwick." Threll Voss set the rifle down, careful not to touch it more than he had to. "You are a fine technician. Your work on the sensor array last cycle was noticed. But this weapon does not belong on a modern battlefield. It belongs in a display case, next to a plaque explaining what humans once used before we gave you real technology." A few officers nodded. One of them, a younger Velkari named Cade Oren, leaned toward his friend and said something in their language that made the friend snort with laughter. I did not need a translator to guess what he had said. I had heard versions of this speech more times than I wanted to remember. Since the day humans joined the wider community of species 3 years ago, we had been treated like the newest, smallest kid in a very large family. The Velkari were not cruel, not exactly. They shared their outposts, their star maps, their medical technology, but they never let us forget that they saw themselves as the older, wiser species, and us as something still learning to walk. "May I keep it anyway?" I said, "since it is mine." Threll Voss waved a hand, already losing interest. "Keep your antique. Just do not expect it to protect you if something serious happens out here." I picked the rifle up off the table, slung it over my shoulder, and walked out of the briefing hall without another word. Behind me, I could still hear them talking, their voices dropping into that easy, amused tone people use when they think the joke is over and they can move on to something else. Outside, the air on Outpost Kestrel was thin and cold, filtered through domes that kept the atmosphere breathable. The colony sat on a moon called Perrin's Reach, a rocky, mountainous place with valleys deep enough to swallow a starship whole. Humans and Velkari had built the outpost together, a joint research and defense post meant to watch over a stretch of space where old borders used to be contested. It was quiet duty mostly, sensor sweeps, supply runs, the occasional patrol along the ridge lines, nothing that required the kind of firepower the Velkari liked to show off. I found Owen Blake near the vehicle bay, checking the treads on one of the rovers. Owen was human too, a mechanic who had been on Kestrel almost as long as I had. He looked up when he saw my face. "They got to you again," he said. It wasn't a question. They mocked my rifle in front of the whole command staff. I leaned against the rover, letting the cold metal take some of the tension out of my shoulders. Threll Voss held it like it was something diseased. Owen wiped his hands on a rag and shook his head. "You know they don't mean it as an insult. Not really. To them, it's just true. Their weapons can do things ours can't. Why would they respect something slower and weaker?" "It's not weaker," I said. "It's just different. Try telling them that." I almost smiled. Almost. The truth was, I didn't blame Owen for thinking that way, because most days, even I had to remind myself why I still carried the rifle, instead of requesting one of their energy weapons like some of the other human staff had done. Part of it was sentiment. My grandfather had carried a version of that rifle during his service, and his father before him. Part of it was training. I had spent years learning that weapon before I ever set foot on another planet, learning its weight, its recoil, its sound. It felt like an extension of my own hands. But part of it, if I was honest with myself, was something harder to explain. A feeling, maybe an instinct, that told me the day might come when simple would matter more than powerful. That evening, alarms went off across the outpost. I was in my quarters, cleaning the rifle out of habit more than need, when the sound cut through the walls. Not the low warning tone we used for supply drops or maintenance alerts, but the sharp, rising pulse that meant something urgent. I grabbed the rifle without thinking and was in the corridor within seconds, moving toward the command center along with a stream of other personnel, both human and Velkari. The command center was already crowded by the time I reached it. Screens along the far wall showed a live feed from a long-range sensor post, positioned near the edge of a valley, the locals called the Hollow, a jagged scar in the moon's surface where mineral deposits played strange tricks with instruments. A perimeter station near the Hollow had gone silent an hour earlier. No response to hails, no telemetry, just static where a steady stream of data used to be. Threll Voss stood near the main display, his usual calm expression replaced by something tighter, more focused. Beside him stood Commander Dessa Rowe, leader of the outpost's most decorated unit, a group of 6 Velkari soldiers known across the sector as the Ember Guard. I had seen them train. I had seen the way their energy rifles could turn a target dummy into scorched metal in less than a second. If there was any unit on Kestrel built to handle a crisis, it was theirs. Contact was lost at 1400 hours, Dessa Rowe reported, her voice level and controlled. No signs of external interference on our end. Could be equipment failure. Could be something else. We do not guess, Threll Voss said. We confirm. Take your squad to the Hollow. Re-establish the perimeter post, determine the cause, and report back. Dessa Rowe nodded once, sharp and certain. Understood. I stepped forward before I fully decided to. I know that valley. I mapped part of it during the terrain survey last year. There are mineral pockets that interfere with electronic signals. It might just be a dead zone, not an attack. Dessa Rowe glanced at me, her eyes flicking briefly to the rifle over my shoulder, and something in her expression made it clear she had already decided my opinion did not carry much weight. We have accounted for terrain interference in our equipment. Our systems are shielded against far worse than mineral static. I could come with you, I offered, extra set of eyes on the ground. A few of the Ember Guard soldiers behind her actually laughed, quiet and quick, the kind of laugh people give when they think a suggestion is almost too small to bother answering. One of them, a broad-shouldered soldier named Van Kesh, looked at my rifle and shook his head slightly. We appreciate the offer, Dessa Rowe said, in a tone that made it clear she did not appreciate it at all. But this is Ember Guard work. Stay behind the tree line with your museum piece, Fenwick. We will handle it. The room did not laugh out loud this time, but I felt the amusement all the same, a quiet ripple of condescension passing through the officers watching the exchange. Colonel Ashby, standing near the back again, caught my eye for half a second. He didn't say anything either. There wasn't anything to say that would have changed the outcome. I stepped back and let them go. Within 20 minutes, the Ember Guard had boarded their transport, 6 soldiers in gleaming armor, energy rifles charged and ready, moving with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having lost a fight that mattered. I watched their transport lift off from the landing pad and turn toward the mountains, engines glowing bright against the darkening sky, until it disappeared over the ridgeline toward the Hollow. I told myself it would be fine. They were the best trained unit on the outpost, armed with weapons that could level a building. Whatever had gone silent out there, whatever had caused that perimeter post to stop transmitting, it did not stand a chance against 6 of the Velkari's finest soldiers. I told myself that, and some part of me almost believed it. But as I walked back toward my quarters that night, the rifle still slung over my shoulder, I found myself thinking about the Hollow, about the strange readings we had gotten during the terrain survey, about the way the valley seemed to swallow signals whole in certain pockets, the way our scanners had glitched and stuttered whenever we got too close to certain rock formations. The Ember Guard trusted their shielding, their confidence, their weapons. I trusted very little that I had not tested myself. That night, I did not sleep well. I kept the rifle within reach, cleaned and loaded, resting against the side of my bed the way it had rested there every night since I first arrived on Kestrel. Somewhere out past the mountains, in a valley full of static and shadow, 6 soldiers who had laughed at an old Earth weapon were moving deeper into the dark. I did not know yet what waited for them there. But by morning, I would understand exactly why that valley had gone silent, and exactly how much their laughter was about to cost them. Morning came with no word from the Hollow, and the silence sat in the command center like a weight nobody wanted to touch. I arrived before my shift officially started, drawn there by the same restlessness that had kept me awake most of the night. The main display still showed the same dead feed from the perimeter post, a flat line of static that had not changed since the alarms first sounded. Threll Voss stood exactly where I had left him hours earlier, though I doubted he had slept either. His usual composed manner had thinned into something brittle, a man trying very hard to look calm while everyone around him could see the cracks. "Any contact?" I asked Owen Blake, who was hunched over a secondary console running signal diagnostics. "Nothing." He didn't look up. Not from the perimeter post. Not from the Ember Guard transport. 6 hours of silence. 6 hours. The Ember Guard had gone in expecting a short reconnaissance and repair mission, re-establish the post, confirm the cause, report back. A few hours at most. Instead, an entire night had passed with no signal at all, not even the routine check-ins their protocol required every hour. Colonel Ashby arrived a few minutes later, his face carrying the particular tiredness of someone who had spent the night making phone calls to people who did not want to hear what he had to say. He crossed the room and spoke quietly with Threll Voss, and though I could not hear every word, I caught enough. Command was requesting an update. A relief unit was already being prepared, but it would take another 12 hours to arrive from the nearest Valkyrie outpost. 12 hours in which nobody on Kestrel knew whether the Ember Guard was alive, injured, or something worse. "We send a drone," Threll Voss said, loud enough now for the room to hear. "A reconnaissance flight over the hollow. If there is a threat, we identify it before committing further personnel." The drone launched an hour later, a sleek reconnaissance unit built for exactly this kind of task, equipped with sensors far more advanced than anything I had used during my terrain survey. I watched its feed from a console near the back of the command center, half expecting to see something dramatic, an ambush, a crash site, some clear answer to the question hanging over the room. Instead, the drone's camera showed exactly what I remembered from my survey. A deep, jagged valley, walls streaked with mineral deposits that caught the light in strange colors, patches of thick fog clinging to the lower ground even in daylight. The perimeter post came into view, a small structure near the valley's edge, and for a moment my chest tightened, expecting to see wreckage, signs of an attack. The post looked untouched, no damage, no fire, no visible bodies, just an empty structure with its door standing open, equipment inside apparently intact but powered down. "Send it deeper," Threll Voss ordered. The drone continued into the valley, following the coordinates the Ember Guard transport had logged before it stopped transmitting. The feed grew grainier the deeper it went, static creeping in at the edges of the picture. The same interference I remembered from my own survey work. Rock formations rich in some mineral I never fully identified seemed to scatter every kind of signal that passed near them. Then the feed died completely. Not a slow degradation, not a gradual loss of picture. One moment the drone was transmitting a shaky, static-filled image of valley walls, and the next moment there was nothing at all. A flat line, identical to the one still frozen on the main display from the perimeter post. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from before. Before, the silence had been uncertain, worried but still hopeful. Now it felt heavier, more like the silence people fall into when they are starting to understand that something has gone seriously wrong. "Equipment failure," one of the Valkyrie technicians offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "The mineral interference in that valley is stronger than our models predicted." "2 failures," Threll Voss said slowly. "A perimeter post, a reconnaissance drone, and an elite combat unit that has not reported in for over 7 hours. He turned to look at the room, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like fear, quickly buried beneath professional composure. This is not simple interference. I felt it too, a cold certainty settling in my stomach. I had walked those valley floors during my survey. I had studied the readings, cataloged the mineral pockets, noted every place where our instruments glitched or lost signal entirely. I knew that valley better than almost anyone on this outpost, human or Valkyrie. And I was starting to remember something I had almost forgotten. A detail from my survey notes that had seemed unimportant at the time, buried among hundreds of other observations, signs that someone, or something, had been moving through that valley long before we ever built the perimeter post there. Old markers cut into rock, cleared paths that looked deliberate rather than natural. At the time, I had assumed they were leftover signs from some earlier survey team, or perhaps natural formations that only looked man-made if you squinted at them the right way. Now I was not so sure. "I need to see the full sensor logs from the Ember Guard transport," I said, stepping closer to the main console. Before contact was lost, any telemetry at all, even partial. Threll Voss looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the same one that had made him dismiss my offer to join the mission the night before. But desperation has a way of changing priorities, and right now, desperation was winning. Pull the logs, he said to the technician nearest the console. The logs that came up were fragmented, full of gaps where the signal had cut out and reconnected, but they told a partial story. The transport had reached the perimeter post without incident, confirmed it was empty and powered down, exactly as the drone footage had shown. From there, the Ember Guard had continued on foot into the valley, following a trail that led deeper toward the hollow's center, likely searching for whatever had caused the post to fail. The last coherent telemetry showed the squad's position roughly 2 kilometers past the post, moving through a narrow section of the valley where the walls rose steep on either side, heart rates elevated, weapon systems reporting full charge. Then a burst of interference, followed by 3 seconds of audio that had somehow survived the signal corruption. Threll Voss ordered it played. The audio was rough, cutting in and out, but underneath the static I could make out Dessa Rowe's voice, sharp and urgent, giving some kind of command I couldn't fully translate. Then a sound I recognized immediately, even distorted through damaged audio, even filtered through a language barrier. The distinct, familiar crack of energy weapons discharging, rapid and overlapping, the sound of soldiers firing in every direction at once. Then nothing. The recording ended in the middle of what might have been a shout, cut off as cleanly as if someone had reached out and switched off the signal by hand. Nobody in the command center spoke for several seconds after the recording finished. I looked around the room and saw the same expression on nearly every face, human and Velkari alike, disbelief, slowly curdling into something closer to dread. Their weapon systems reported full charge, Threll Voss said finally, his voice quieter now. Full charge, and they still fired without effect. That is not possible against anything we know of in this sector. Unless the interference in that valley affects more than communication signals, I said. What if it affects targeting systems too? Power regulation? The things their weapons rely on to function properly? Our weapons are hardened against electromagnetic disruption, said Van Kesh, one of the officers who had laughed at my offer the night before. He looked less amused now. That is basic engineering. Any interference severe enough to disable them would register clearly on our diagnostics. Would it, I said, if the interference is not electromagnetic at all? If it's something in the mineral composition of the valley itself, something that behaves differently from anything your engineers designed against? The room fell quiet again, this time because nobody had an answer. Colonel Ashby cleared his throat, the first time he had spoken since arriving. Fenwick did the original terrain survey of that valley. If anyone on this outpost has insight into what's happening down there, it's her. Threll Voss turned to look at me properly for the first time since the crisis began, and I could see him weighing something, some calculation about pride and necessity that I imagined he did not enjoy making. What insight do you have, Fenwick? I chose my words carefully. There are mineral deposits throughout the hollow that interfere with electronic signals in ways we never fully mapped. My survey found signs that the valley had been used before, paths and markers that didn't look natural. I dismissed it at the time because I had no context for it. Now I think we need to consider the possibility that whoever, or whatever, left those markers is still down there, and that they know how to use the valley's interference to their advantage. You are suggesting a hostile presence, Threll Voss said. One capable of disabling an elite combat unit without triggering a single alarm on our long-range sensors. I'm suggesting we don't actually know what's down there, I said, and that the things we usually rely on to find out, signals, telemetry, remote drones, don't work in that valley, which means the only way to get real answers is to go in with something that doesn't depend on any of that. Silence stretched through the room again, but this time it felt different, less like shock and more like a room full of people slowly arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. A relief unit is still 12 hours out, Colonel Ashby said. We don't have 12 hours if there's any chance members of the Ember Guard are still alive down there. Threll Voss closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, something had shifted in his expression, a decision made against every instinct that had shaped his career. He looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, there was no trace of amusement in his voice at all. Fenwick, you said you know that valley. Better than anyone else on this outpost. And your weapon, he said, glancing at the rifle slung over my shoulder, the same one he had mocked less than a day earlier. Does it depend on any of the systems that failed down there? Power cells, network targeting, electronic charge regulation? I understood exactly what he was asking, and exactly how much it cost him to ask it. No, I said. It's mechanical. Spring, hammer, firing pin, ammunition. It doesn't need power to work. It doesn't need a network. It doesn't need anything but me pulling the trigger correctly. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at me the way someone looks at a puzzle piece they had thrown away and were now forced to search for in the trash. "I still do not believe a single soldier should walk into that valley alone," he said finally. "But we have no working technology capable of operating down there, no relief force close enough to matter, and 6 of my finest soldiers who have not made contact in over 8 hours. If there is any chance of understanding what happened to them, and any chance of bringing back survivors, I am forced to consider options I would not have considered yesterday." I felt something settle inside me, cold and steady, the same feeling I remembered from every serious mission I had trained for back on Earth. Not excitement, not fear exactly, just clarity, the sense of a decision already made somewhere deep inside me long before the words came out of my mouth. "Then let me go," I said. "Give me a comm relay that can survive at least part of the way in case I get close enough for a signal to break through. Otherwise I go in the same way I've gone into every difficult place I've ever worked. Quiet, careful, and paying attention to things that don't show up on a scanner." Threll Voss looked at Colonel Ashby, some silent question passing between them that I couldn't fully read. Ashby gave a small nod, the kind of nod that carried the weight of a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with but had run out of better options to offer. "Prepare her gear," Threll Voss said to the room. Then, turning back to me, his voice dropped lower, quieter, almost private. "Fenwick, last night I called your weapon an antique, a relic that belonged in a display case. I remember," I said. "I hope, for the sake of my soldiers, that I was wrong." I picked up my pack from where I had left it near the door, checked the rifle one final time, feeling the familiar weight of it settle against my shoulder the way it always had, steady and certain in a room full of uncertainty. "So do I said, "but either way, I'm going to find out what's in that valley." Within the hour, I was standing at the edge of Outpost Kestrel's perimeter, looking out toward the mountains where 6 soldiers had vanished and a valley full of secrets waited under a layer of fog and static. I checked my rifle one last time, felt the solid click of the bolt sliding into place, and started walking. The path into the hollow began as a gentle slope of gray stone, easy walking, the kind of terrain that lulls a person into thinking the rest of the journey will be just as simple. I knew better. I had walked this ground once before, during the survey, and I remembered exactly where the easy part ended. Priya Nolan met me at the perimeter gate before I left, carrying a small comm relay unit strapped into a weatherproof case. She was one of the outpost's communications specialists, sharp and quick, someone I trusted more than most of the people who worked in that command center. "This will give you maybe 2 kilometers of range before the interference eats the signal," she said, helping me fit the relay onto my pack. "After that, you're on your own until you either come back into range or find a spot with better line of sight." "Understood." "Nora." She caught my arm before I could turn away, her voice dropping lower. I heard the audio from the transport. "Whatever hit that squad, it hit them fast, and it hit all 6 of them at once. Be careful down there." "I will." I didn't tell her that a part of me had already accepted the possibility I might not walk back out of that valley. It wasn't something worth saying out loud, not when there was a job to do and daylight to use while it lasted. I adjusted the rifle strap across my chest, checked the ammunition pouch on my belt, and started down the slope toward the hollow's mouth. The fog thickened as I descended, clinging low to the ground the way smoke settles in a closed room. My handheld scanner, a basic unit not much different from the ones the perimeter post had used, began flickering within the first half-kilometer, numbers jumping erratically across the display, before settling into long stretches of static. I switched it off entirely after that. If it wasn't going to give me reliable information, it wasn't worth the distraction of watching it fail. Instead, I relied on the things that had kept me alive during training exercises, long before I ever left Earth. My eyes, my ears. The careful, deliberate pace that let me notice details a rushed person would miss. The valley floor grew rougher as I went deeper, jagged rock formations rising on either side, streaked with veins of a dark mineral that seemed to drink the daylight rather than reflect it. I remembered these formations from my survey, remembered noting the strange way sound seemed to travel differently near them, muffled in some directions and unnervingly clear in others. At the time, I had written it off as an interesting geological quirk. Now, walking through it alone with a threat somewhere ahead of me, every muffled echo and strange acoustic shift felt like something worth paying close attention to. I reached the perimeter post roughly 40 minutes after entering the valley. It looked exactly as the drone footage had shown, small and quiet, its door hanging open, equipment inside dark and unresponsive. I moved through it carefully, checking corners out of habit even though every sign suggested it had been empty for hours. Whoever had knocked this post offline had done it cleanly, without leaving behind any of the usual signs of a struggle. No scorch marks, no forced entry, no blood. That detail bothered me more than almost anything else I had seen so far. 2 Velkari technicians had been stationed here, and there was no sign of what had happened to them at all. Not captured, not killed, not fled. Simply gone, as if the valley itself had swallowed them whole. I found something more useful outside the post, in the soft ground near its entrance. Footprints, faint but visible in the thin layer of dust that had settled since the last rainfall on this side of the moon. 2 sets belonging to the missing technicians, moving away from the post toward the valley's interior, and a third set, different from the others, wider and deeper, pressed into the ground with more force than the technicians' prints, as if whoever left them had been carrying significant weight, or moving with unusual purpose. I crouched beside the prints, studying the pattern. Not Velkari footwear, not the smooth-soled boots their standard uniforms used. This tread was rougher, uneven, almost handmade in its irregularity. Whoever, or whatever, had left these prints was not wearing anything issued by the outpost supply depot. I followed the trail deeper into the valley, moving slower now, checking my surroundings every few steps the way I had been trained to do years ago. The fog thickened further as the walls of the hollow drew closer together, narrowing into the section the Ember Guard transport's last telemetry had marked before contact was lost. It was here that I found the first real evidence of what had happened to Dessa Rowe's squad. A patch of scorched ground, blackened in a pattern that told a story if you knew how to read it. Energy weapon discharge, multiple shots fired in a tight cluster, aimed outward from a central point as if the shooter had been surrounded and firing in every direction at once, exactly as the audio recording had suggested. But the scorch marks told me something the audio couldn't. Most of the shots had struck rock, or empty ground, or nothing at all. Wild, panicked fire, the kind soldiers use when they can't clearly see what they're shooting at. Nearby, half buried in loose stone, I found a piece of Velkari armor plating, its edge jagged where it had been torn away rather than cut cleanly. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, studying the damage. Not an energy weapon wound. This was blunt force trauma, the kind of damage caused by something solid striking with tremendous force, again and again, until the metal gave way. Whatever had ambushed the Ember Guard, it had not used energy weapons at all. It had used something far more direct. I kept moving, following the trail of scorched ground and disturbed earth deeper into the narrowing valley, my senses sharpened to a point I hadn't felt in years. Every sound seemed louder here, every shift of loose stone under my boots impossibly loud in the thick, fog-laden air. I found myself falling back into old habits without thinking, moving in short bursts between points of cover, pausing to listen before advancing further, exactly the way I had been trained to move through hostile territory, long before I ever set foot on another world. The valley walls rose higher around me until they nearly blocked out the sky entirely, the fog pooling thicker in the shadow they cast. I found more signs of the fight as I went, scattered pieces of equipment, another section of scorched ground, a communication unit crushed flat as if something enormous had stepped on it deliberately. And then, in a wide clearing where the valley opened up slightly, I found the wreckage of what remained of the encounter. 2 members of the Ember Guard lay motionless near a rock formation, their armor cracked and dented. Energy rifles still gripped in their hands but powerless, drained of whatever charge remained after the fight. I approached carefully, checking for any sign of life, my throat tight with a grief I hadn't expected to feel for soldiers who had mocked me only a day earlier. Both were gone. I said nothing out loud, but I made a silent promise to bring them home, one way or another, once I understood what I was dealing with. There was no sign of the other 4 squad members, including Dessa Rowe herself. No bodies. No obvious trail leading away from the clearing. Either they had been taken somewhere, or they had scattered during the fight and were still out there, hiding, possibly injured, possibly worse. I studied the clearing more carefully, moving in a slow circle around its edges, reading the ground the way I had been taught to read terrain years ago during training exercises that had felt, at the time, almost too tedious to bother learning properly. Every scuff mark, every disturbed patch of stone, every broken branch on the sparse, hardy vegetation that managed to grow even in this strange, fog-choked place. The picture that emerged troubled me more than I wanted to admit. Whatever had attacked the Ember Guard had not come from one direction. The scorch marks, the drag marks, the pattern of destruction across the clearing all suggested an ambush from multiple points at once. An enemy that understood the terrain well enough to surround 6 of the sector's most feared soldiers before they even realized they were under threat. That kind of coordination did not come from a random predator or a lone hostile creature. It came from something organized, something intelligent, something that had likely used this valley, and its strange interference with electronic equipment, as a deliberate hunting ground for a very long time. I thought back to the markers I had noted during my original survey, the paths and cut stones I had dismissed as leftover signs from some earlier expedition. Standing here now, surrounded by evidence of an ambush too well executed to be an accident, I understood with cold certainty that those markers had not been leftover signs of anything. They had been deliberate, territorial, a warning I had failed to recognize when it might have mattered most. I crouched near the center of the clearing, studying a set of the same wide, irregular footprints I had found near the perimeter post, pressed deep into softer ground here where the fight had apparently reached its peak. Multiple sets now, at least 4 or 5 distinct trails, converging on this spot from different directions before scattering again, some leading deeper into the valley, one leading toward a narrow crevice in the rock wall I hadn't noticed at first glance. Whatever these creatures were, they hunted in coordinated groups. They understood the valley's interference well enough to use it as cover against modern weapons, and judging by the destroyed communication equipment and the deliberate targeting of the perimeter post before the Ember Guard ever arrived, they had been planning this, or something like it, for longer than a single day. I checked my rifle, feeling the familiar weight settle in my hands as I worked through the calculation every soldier eventually learns to make, weighing the risk of continuing forward against the responsibility of finding out what had happened to the missing squad members. Colonel Ashby and Threll Voss were waiting for answers back at the outpost. Somewhere in this valley, possibly still alive, were 4 soldiers who had laughed at my rifle less than a day earlier, and who might now be relying on someone with exactly that rifle to bring them home. I moved toward the narrow crevice in the rock wall, the trail leading into it clearer than any of the others, deep prints pressed into soft ground with the particular urgency of something being dragged rather than walking under its own power. The fog seemed to thicken as I approached the opening, curling around the jagged rock edges like something almost alive. I paused at the threshold, listening carefully, catching the faint sound of movement somewhere deep within the darkness beyond. A low, rhythmic sound that might have been breathing, might have been something else entirely. I thought of Threll Voss's voice back in the command center, the careful, uncertain way he had asked whether my weapon depended on any of the systems that had failed the Ember Guard so completely. I thought of Dessa Rowe's dismissal the night before, the easy confidence with which she had told me to stay behind the tree line with my museum piece. I checked the chamber of my rifle one final time, confirmed the safety was off, and stepped into the crevice. Whatever waited in the darkness ahead, I intended to find out exactly what it was, and exactly how to end the threat it posed, before it claimed anyone else. The passage narrowed further as I moved deeper, the walls pressing close enough on either side that I had to turn my shoulders slightly to pass through certain sections. The rhythmic sound grew louder as I advanced, resolving slowly into something that was unmistakably breathing, deep and slow, the kind of sound that came from something large. Then, ahead of me, past a bend in the passage where the darkness gave way to a faint, strange luminescence radiating from the mineral veins in the rock, I heard something else. A voice, weak but unmistakably alive, speaking in the clipped, precise cadence of the Velkari language. Someone from the Ember Guard was still alive down here. I moved forward faster now, every instinct sharpening into a single point of focus, the careful patience I had maintained throughout the journey giving way to something more urgent. Whatever creatures had ambushed the squad, whatever coordinated, intelligent threat had turned 6 of the sector's finest soldiers into scattered casualties within minutes, I was about to meet it directly. And this time, unlike the soldiers who had come before me, I intended to be ready. The passage opened into a wide cavern lit by the faint, sickly glow of mineral veins running through the rock like frozen lightning, and the first thing I saw was Dessa Rowe, chained by something thick and organic looking to the cavern wall, her armor stripped away, her breathing shallow but steady. I dropped low behind a rock formation near the entrance, forcing myself to slow down, to look before acting. Years of training had taught me that the moment you see the thing you came for is exactly the moment you are most likely to get killed by rushing toward it. The cavern was large, its ceiling lost somewhere above in shadow and fog, its floor uneven and scattered with debris that looked disturbingly like broken pieces of energy weapons and shredded armor plating. Along the far wall, past where Dessa Rowe hung suspended, I could make out 2 more shapes, also bound, also Velkari, though I couldn't tell from this distance whether they were alive or not. And moving between them, low and deliberate, were the creatures responsible. They were larger than I expected, easily the height of a tall human, with dense, muscular bodies covered in mottled gray hide that seemed to blend almost perfectly with the cavern's rock walls. 4 limbs built for both climbing and striking, tipped with claws long enough to explain the torn armor plating I had found earlier. Their heads were low and wide, with multiple sets of dark eyes that reflected the faint mineral light in an unsettling way, and their movements carried a fluid, coordinated grace that told me immediately these were not mindless animals. They moved like hunters who had done this many times before. I counted 5 of them from my position, though the cavern's shadows made it hard to be certain there weren't more further back. 5 creatures, working together with obvious coordination, guarding at least 3 captives, in a cavern deep inside a valley whose mineral composition had rendered every piece of modern technology useless. I understood now, watching them move, exactly why the Ember Guard's energy weapons had failed so completely. It wasn't only the valley's interference disrupting their power systems, though that was clearly part of it. It was the creatures themselves. Their hide had an odd, almost metallic sheen beneath the mottled gray, and I remembered the way certain minerals could conduct or disperse energy in strange ways. If their bodies were naturally suited to interacting with the same minerals saturating this valley, it would explain how they had managed to close the distance on an armed, alert squad, without triggering a single clean shot, before overwhelming them entirely. Dessa Rowe stirred against her restraints, and one of the creatures near her let out a low, guttural sound, more warning than aggression, enough to make her go still again. She was alive, aware, and from what I could see, largely uninjured beyond exhaustion and whatever restraints held her in place. That was good. It meant these creatures hunted to capture as much as to kill, which gave me more time to work with than I had feared. I studied the cavern layout carefully, mapping exits, cover points, and the positions of each creature relative to the captives. 2 of them patrolled slowly along the cavern's perimeter, moving in a loose pattern that suggested habit more than active alertness. 2 more remained near the captives, close enough to intervene quickly if needed. The 5th moved between different points in the cavern in no pattern I could immediately identify, though I noted it seemed to check on something near the back of the cave every few minutes, a detail I filed away without yet understanding its significance. My rifle felt steady in my hands as I settled into position behind the rock formation, working through the calculation every experienced shooter learns to make, almost without conscious thought. 5 targets, 3 captives whose safety depended on how I handled the next several minutes. A weapon that, unlike everything else that had been brought into this valley, would not fail me due to interference or drained power cells. But a rifle with a limited number of rounds, reloaded by hand, without the rapid-fire capability of an energy weapon. If I opened with a shot that didn't drop a target instantly, I would lose the advantage of surprise immediately, and 5 coordinated hunters would turn their full attention on me at once. I needed to be patient. I needed to be certain. I watched the patrol pattern of the 2 perimeter creatures for several minutes, timing their movements, noting the moment when their paths carried them furthest from the captives and from each other. It reminded me of watching predator behavior back during survival training exercises on Earth, the same principle applying here despite how far from home I now found myself. Every hunter, no matter how alien, tends to fall into patterns eventually, especially when they believe themselves unchallenged. The moment came roughly 6 minutes after I had settled into position. Both perimeter creatures had drifted to the furthest points of their patrol route, one near the cavern entrance behind me, one near a passage on the far side I hadn't explored yet. The 2 creatures near the captives remained close, but one had turned partially away, focused on something near the 3rd captive I still couldn't clearly see. I raised my rifle, breathed out slowly, and settled the sight on the nearest guarding creature, the one closest to Dessa Rowe and most likely to react fastest if I failed to drop it cleanly. The first shot cracked through the cavern's stillness, sharp and final, nothing like the humming discharge of an energy weapon. The creature staggered, let out a sound closer to surprise than pain, and collapsed before it fully registered what had happened to it. For one heartbeat, the cavern held perfectly still, as if even the fog itself had paused to understand what had just occurred. Then chaos broke loose. The second creature near the captives spun toward the sound, its multiple eyes fixing on my position with unsettling speed. I was already moving, shifting to a new position behind a different section of rock as I worked the bolt on my rifle, chambering another round with the smooth, practiced motion that years of training had carved into muscle memory. The creature charged, covering ground faster than its bulky frame suggested it should be capable of, claws extended, a deep growl building somewhere in its wide chest. I fired again, aiming for the joint where its foreleg met its shoulder, a spot I had noted during my observation as less protected by the thick hide covering the rest of its body. The shot connected, and the creature's charge broke into an uneven stumble, giving me the half-second I needed to work the bolt again and put a second round through a more vital point. It went down hard, skidding across the cavern floor and coming to rest just short of the rock formation I had moved behind. 2 down, 3 remaining, and now fully alerted to my presence. The 2 perimeter creatures were already converging, moving with the same fluid speed I had seen from the one that charged me, cutting off my clearest path back toward the cavern entrance. The 5th creature, the one whose pattern I hadn't fully understood, emerged from the shadows near the back of the cave, and in the mineral light, I finally saw why it had kept returning to that spot. It was guarding something. A cluster of what looked disturbingly like eggs, clustered together near a warm section of rock, protected in a shallow nest carved into the stone. This wasn't just a hunting ground, it was a nesting site, and I had just killed 2 of its guardians directly in front of everything it existed to protect. The creature let out a sound unlike anything the others had made, a deep, resonant call that echoed through the cavern, and seemed to shift something in the 2 approaching creatures, their movements sharpening from coordinated hunting into something closer to desperate, protective aggression. I had very little time to reconsider my position. 3 creatures now converging from different directions, at least one of them driven by something more urgent than simple territorial defense, and 3 captives still bound and vulnerable in the middle of it all. I moved fast, abandoning the rock formation that had served me well for the opening exchange, cutting toward a narrower section of the cavern where the tight space would prevent more than one creature from reaching me at once. My boots found uneven footing on the scattered debris, and I stumbled slightly, catching myself against the cold stone wall just as the nearest creature closed the distance faster than I had anticipated. I fired from an awkward angle, the shot landing but not dropping it, and for a moment, I found myself face to face with something built to kill soldiers wearing armor far heavier than my thin field jacket, its claws already rising for a strike I wasn't fully positioned to avoid. I threw myself sideways, feeling the rush of air as its claws swept through the space I had occupied a half-second earlier, and used the momentum of the fall to bring my rifle around, firing upward at close range into the softer underside of its jaw, as it turned to follow my movement. The shot connected solidly, and the creature collapsed almost on top of me, forcing me to scramble backward to avoid being pinned beneath its weight as it went still. 3 down, 2 remaining, including the one guarding the nest, and I had lost track of exactly where the last perimeter creature had gone in the chaos of the fight. I pushed myself back to my feet, ignoring the ache already spreading through my shoulder where I had landed hard against the stone floor, and turned to find Dessa Rowe watching me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not the sharp, dismissive confidence from the command center. Something closer to disbelief, mixed with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Behind you," she said, her voice hoarse but urgent. I spun in time to see the last perimeter creature closing fast, having circled around during the fight to approach from a direction I hadn't been watching closely enough. My rifle came up on reflex, but I already knew, in the half-second it took to sight the shot, that I wouldn't have time to fire before it reached me. I fired anyway, trusting the training that had carried me this far, trusting the weapon that had never once failed me, despite every doubt anyone had thrown at it since I first arrived at this outpost. The shot found its mark just as the creature's claws reached the edge of my jacket, close enough that I felt the fabric tear even as the round dropped at mid-stride, its momentum carrying it forward to collapse in a heap barely a meter from where I stood. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, my hands steadier than I expected them to be given everything that had just happened, and looked toward the back of the cavern where the 5th creature still crouched over its nest, watching me with an intensity that told me this fight was far from finished. The last creature did not charge the way the others had. It stayed low over its nest, its wide head tracking my every movement, and I understood immediately that this one would not be lured into the same mistakes I had used against the others. I kept my rifle raised, moving slowly along the edge of the cavern, using the scattered rock formations as cover while I tried to work through a plan that didn't involve walking directly into the range of something clearly more cautious and more dangerous than the 4 I had already dropped. My ammunition pouch was lighter than I liked, only a handful of rounds remaining after the exchange, and I forced myself to think carefully about every shot from this point forward. "Fenwick," Dessa Rowe's voice carried across the cavern, quieter now but steady. "Free me. I can help." I glanced toward her, weighing the risk of turning my attention away from the creature even for a few seconds, but she was right that leaving her bound accomplished nothing, and if there was any chance of ending this fight without losing anyone else, having a second set of hands, even without a functioning weapon, was worth the risk. I moved toward her in a crouch, keeping the rifle trained on the creature near the nest, and used my free hand to work at the restraints binding her wrists. They were organic, some kind of thick, fibrous material the creatures must have produced themselves, tough, but not impossible to cut through. I drew the small blade I carried strapped to my boot, sawed through the restraint quickly, and felt her drop free beside me, immediately steadying herself against the cavern wall. "The other two," I said, nodding toward the captives further along the wall. "Are they alive?" "Van is." Her voice tightened. Cade did not survive the initial attack. I filed that grief away for later, the way I had learned to do during every difficult mission I had ever completed, understanding that there would be time to feel the full weight of it once everyone who could still be saved was actually safe. "We free Van," I said. "Then we deal with the last one and get out of here." Desaro nodded, moving with obvious effort, but steady determination toward where Van Kesh hung restrained a short distance away, his armor stripped like hers, his breathing shallow but present. I kept my position near the center of the cavern, rifle steady on the remaining creature, watching for any sign it intended to break from its defensive posture over the nest. It didn't move, not yet. But its multiple eyes tracked every motion in the cavern with unsettling precision, and I had the distinct sense that it was waiting, calculating, exactly the way I had been calculating against the others. "Van is free," Desaro called quietly. "He can walk, barely. Get him toward the passage." "I'll cover you." I began backing toward the cavern entrance, matching my pace to theirs, keeping my rifle trained on the last creature the entire time. It watched us go without immediately pursuing, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope this might end without requiring a final confrontation. Then it moved. Not toward us directly, but toward a narrow gap in the cavern wall near the nest, disappearing from sight with a speed that told me it was not fleeing but repositioning, choosing ground it understood better than the open cavern floor where it had watched its companions fall. "It's flanking," I said, more to myself than to Desaro, already scanning the cavern for the most likely point it might reappear. We reached the narrow passage leading back toward the crevice entrance, and I paused there, letting Desaro and Van continue ahead while I held position, watching the shadows for any sign of movement. The fog seemed thicker here, curling low across the ground, and the mineral light from the walls cast strange, shifting patterns that made it difficult to distinguish real movement from the tricks my own tired eyes were starting to play on me. I heard it before I saw it, a faint scrape of claws against stone somewhere above and to my left, and I threw myself sideways just as it dropped from a ledge I hadn't noticed, claws raking through the space where I had been standing a half-second earlier. I rolled, came up on one knee, and fired before it could fully recover its footing from the drop, the shot catching it along the flank rather than anywhere immediately vital. It let out that same deep, resonant call I had heard earlier, and I understood with sudden clarity that this was not merely pain, it was a signal, something meant to summon help. I had no way of knowing how many more of these creatures might be within range to answer that call, and I did not intend to find out. I fired again, working the bolt as fast as my hands could manage, and this time the shot found its mark cleanly, dropping the creature for good just as it gathered itself for another strike. The cavern fell silent except for the ragged sound of my own breathing and the distant, uneven footsteps of Desaro helping Van Kesh toward the passage ahead. I stood there for a long moment, rifle still raised, waiting to see if that final call would bring more of the creatures rushing toward us from somewhere deeper in the valley. When nothing came, I finally allowed myself to lower the weapon, though I kept it close, unwilling to fully relax until we were well clear of the hollow entirely. "Fenwick." Desaro's voice came from further down the passage, and I moved to catch up, finding her supporting most of Van Kesh's weight against her shoulder. His armor was gone, his face pale from blood loss and exhaustion, but his eyes were alert, watching me with an expression that mirrored the disbelief I had seen on Desaro's face back in the cavern. "You came alone," he said, his voice weak but clear. "With that?" I glanced down at the rifle in my hands, its familiar weight steady despite everything it had just been through. "Yes." He shook his head slowly, though whether from exhaustion or genuine astonishment I couldn't tell. "We had the finest weapons in the sector. Full charge, hardened against interference, more firepower in 6 soldiers than most colonies keep for defense. And it meant nothing the moment those things closed the distance. The valley's minerals interfere with your power systems," I said, "and their hide seems to interact with the same minerals in some way that made it worse. My rifle doesn't need power. It doesn't need a network. It just needs me to aim correctly and pull the trigger." Desiree was quiet for a moment, adjusting her grip to better support Van, as we continued toward the passage entrance. Last night, I told you to stay behind the tree line with your museum piece. I remember? I was wrong, she said simply, and there was no trace of the sharp condescension I had grown used to hearing from her, just quiet, exhausted honesty. Whatever respect I owe you for that mistake, you have earned tenfold today. I didn't answer right away, focused instead on navigating the narrow passage while keeping watch for any further movement in the shadows around us. Grief and relief tangled together in a way that made speech difficult, the weight of what I had just done settling slowly over me now that the immediate danger had passed. 5 creatures eliminated, 1 soldier lost before I ever arrived, 2 survivors I was now responsible for bringing safely back to the outpost, through a valley that had already proven itself far more dangerous than anyone on Kestrel had understood. We emerged from the crevice back into the wider section of the hollow roughly 20 minutes later, the fog thinning slightly as we moved toward the clearing where I had first found the wreckage of the initial ambush. I paused there, taking a moment to properly account for what remained of the fallen soldiers, making the same silent promise I had made earlier that they would not be left behind in this place. We'll send a proper recovery team, Desiree said quietly, understanding my hesitation without needing it explained. For now, we need to get Van back to medical care. He's lost too much blood to wait any longer than necessary. I nodded, adjusting my pack and rifle for the journey back, and we began the slow trek out of the valley, moving with far more caution than I had used on the way in, aware now of exactly what kind of danger this ground could hide. The comm relay Priya Nolan had fitted onto my pack crackled to life roughly a kilometer from the valley's edge, static giving way slowly to a clear, panicked voice that I recognized immediately as belonging to Owen Blake. Fenwick, this is Kestrel Command. Do you copy? Fenwick, please respond. I keyed the relay, my voice rough from exertion but steady. This is Fenwick. I have Commander Rowe and Van Kesh with me, both alive. Requesting immediate medical support at the valley perimeter. There was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable, before Owen's voice came back, thick with relief. Copy that, Fenwick. Medical team is already moving. Colonel Ashby wants to know, is the threat neutralized? I looked back over my shoulder, toward the fog-shrouded entrance of the hollow, thinking of the cavern behind us, the fallen creatures, the empty nest that would likely never hatch now, and the price that had been paid on both sides of this encounter. The immediate threat is neutralized, I said. But that valley isn't as empty as we thought it was. Tell the Colonel we have a lot to discuss once I'm back. Copy that. And Fenwick? Owen's voice carried a note I hadn't heard from him before, something between disbelief and pride. High Marshal Threll Voss wants to see you the moment you're back. He's been asking about you every 10 minutes since you left. I allowed myself a tired, small smile as we continued walking toward the valley's edge, toward the outpost lights just beginning to appear against the darkening sky ahead of us. I'm sure he has some questions, I said. By the time we reached the perimeter gate, medical personnel were already waiting, moving quickly to take Van Kesh into their care while Desiree waved off assistance for herself, insisting on walking the rest of the way under her own strength despite her obvious exhaustion. I trailed behind them, the rifle still slung across my shoulder, its metal warm from use, its weight somehow both heavier and lighter than it had felt that morning. Colonel Ashby met us just inside the gate, his relief evident in the way his shoulders dropped the moment he saw all 3 of us walking, alive and mostly intact. Behind him, moving with far less composure than I had ever seen from him, came High Marshal Threll Voss, his eyes moving over Desiree, over Van Kesh, and finally settling on me, on the rifle still resting against my shoulder. He said nothing for a long moment, and I watched something complicated pass across his expression, pride and shame and disbelief, all tangled together in a way that no amount of Velkari composure could fully hide. Fenwick, he said finally, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. We need to speak, now. I know, I said. There's a lot to explain. He glanced once more at the rifle, and this time, there was no trace of mockery left in his expression at all. Yes, he said, there certainly is. The briefing hall looked different that evening than it had the night before, though nothing about the room itself had changed. The same table, the same chairs arranged in the same careful order, the same officers gathered along the walls. What had changed was the silence, heavier now, and the way every eye in the room followed me the moment I walked through the door, rifle still slung over my shoulder, my clothes still marked with dust and dried mud from the valley. High Marshal Threll Voss stood at the head of the table, and beside him, Colonel Ashby, both of them waiting with an expression I had not seen from either of them before. Dessa Rowe sat near the front, cleaned up and treated by medical staff, though the exhaustion still showed clearly in the way she held herself. Van Kesh had been kept in medical care, stable but recovering, unable to attend, but insisting through the staff that his report would confirm every detail Dessa Rowe was prepared to give. "Sit, Fenwick," Threll Voss said, and it was not a command delivered with the same casual authority I remembered from the night before. It came out almost gentle, almost uncertain, the voice of someone genuinely unsure how to begin a conversation he had never expected to need. I sat. "Tell us what happened," Colonel Ashby said. "From the beginning. Everything you saw, everything you did." I told them. I described the journey into the valley, the footprints near the perimeter post, the scorched ground and shattered armor that told the story of an ambush the Ember Guard had never seen coming. I described the cavern, the captives, the 5 creatures whose bodies I later learned had been examined by outpost scientists and found to contain trace elements of the exact minerals that saturated the hollow, a natural adaptation that let them move through the valley's interference as easily as I moved through open air, while it crippled every piece of technology the Valkyrie had brought with them. I described the fight itself, careful and precise, leaving out nothing, not the moments of doubt, not the near miss when the last creature's claws had torn through my jacket close enough to draw blood along my arm, not the grief of learning that Cade Oren, the young officer who had laughed at my rifle alongside his friends the night before, had not survived long enough for me to reach him. When I finished, the room stayed quiet for a long time. 6 of my best soldiers, Threll Voss said eventually, his voice carrying a weight I had never heard from him before. Equipped with the finest weapons our engineers could design, overwhelmed within minutes by creatures that our advanced targeting systems failed to properly detect, disabled by an environment our sensors failed to properly assess. He paused, looking at me directly. And a single human, armed with a weapon I mocked in this very room less than a day ago, went in alone and came out having neutralized the threat entirely, while recovering 2 survivors we might otherwise have lost. "I had help," I said. "Dessa Rowe fought beside me the moment she was free. I couldn't have gotten Van out of that valley without her." Dessa Rowe spoke up from her seat, her voice still rough but steady. "She is being generous. I was unarmed, injured, and barely capable of standing when she reached us. Every creature that fell in that cavern fell to her rifle, and her rifle alone." She looked toward Threll Voss. "High Marshal, I owe her my life. So does Van Kesh. I think it is time this outpost understood exactly why." Threll Voss was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the rifle resting against my shoulder, the same weapon he had picked up with obvious distaste the night before, holding it away from his body like something diseased. "How," he said finally, "how does a weapon this simple succeed where our most advanced technology failed so completely?" I thought about how to answer that question honestly, without arrogance, without pretending the answer was simple. "It isn't about the weapon being better," I said. "In an open field, against a target with no way to disrupt your systems, your energy rifles would outperform mine easily. Faster fire rate, more damage per shot, better range. I know that. I've always known that." "Then explain the difference," Threll Voss said. "My rifle doesn't rely on anything outside itself," I said. "No power cell that can be drained by interference. No network connection that can be jammed. No targeting computer that can be confused by an environment it wasn't designed to handle. It's a spring, a hammer, a firing pin, and a piece of metal moving fast enough to do what needs to be done. As long as I can load it and aim it, it works, no matter what's happening around me." I looked around the room, at the officers who had laughed the night before, at the ones who were listening now with an entirely different expression. Humanity built weapons like this a long time ago, before we understood half of what your engineers understand now about energy systems and targeting networks. We built them simple because we had no other choice, and over time, we learned that simple has its own kind of strength. It doesn't need permission to work. It doesn't need favorable conditions. It just needs someone who knows how to use it, and it will keep working long after more advanced systems have failed. Threll Voss absorbed that in silence, and I could see him turning the words over, testing them against everything he had believed about the relationship between technology and strength, since long before humans had ever joined the wider community of species. "We built our military doctrine around the assumption that greater technology always meant greater capability," he said slowly. "We never seriously considered an environment that could neutralize that advantage entirely. Your species, it seems, has spent your history preparing for exactly that possibility, whether by choice or by necessity." "By necessity, mostly," I said. "Earth wasn't kind to us for a long time. We learned to build things that would work even when everything else failed, because we couldn't always count on having the most advanced tools available. That lesson stuck with us longer than I think even we realized. Colonel Ashby spoke up then, his voice carrying a note of quiet pride he had kept carefully hidden throughout most of the meeting. It's not just about the weapon. It's about the mindset behind it. Redundancy, adaptability, a willingness to rely on something proven, even when something newer looks more impressive on paper. Threll Voss nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had known him, I watched something shift fundamentally in the way he looked at me, at the rifle resting against my shoulder, at the entire framework of assumptions he had carried into every interaction with humans since our two species had first met. "I owe you an apology, Fenwick," he said, "not only for the mockery in this room last night, but for the disrespect embedded in how our command structure has treated human capabilities since our alliance began. We assumed superiority based on the sophistication of our tools, without properly considering the value of the skill and philosophy behind simpler ones. That was a mistake, and today it nearly cost the lives of soldiers I am responsible for." "Apology accepted," I said. "But I'd rather you show it than say it. Give humans on this outpost real input on defense planning, especially anywhere technology might be unreliable. We've got more to offer than most people here have given us credit for." "Agreed," Threll Voss said, without hesitation this time. "Starting immediately, human personnel will be consulted on any mission where environmental conditions might compromise standard equipment. And Fenwick," he paused, something almost like genuine warmth entering his voice for the first time since I had met him, "that rifle of yours. I believe I owe it an apology as well." A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the room, different from the laughter the night before, lighter, more genuine, the kind shared by people who had all just come through something difficult together and were relieved to find a moment of levity on the other side of it. "It's not obsolete," I said, resting my hand on the worn stock of the rifle, feeling the familiar grain of metal and wood beneath my palm. "It just doesn't need permission to work." Threll Voss allowed himself something close to a genuine smile, small but real. A lesson I suspect this entire outpost needed to learn. The meeting continued for another hour after that, working through the logistics of a proper recovery mission for Cade Orin, the reinforcement of the perimeter post with equipment better suited to the Hollow's interference, and a broader review of defense protocols that would, over the following weeks, quietly transform the way Kestrel's command structure viewed the value of simple, reliable tools, alongside more advanced technology. But the moment that stayed with me longest, the one I carried with me long after the meeting ended and I finally returned to my quarters that night, exhausted in a way that went far deeper than physical tiredness, was the look on Dessa Rowe's face as I passed her seat on my way out of the briefing hall. She stood, despite her exhaustion, and offered a formal gesture of respect I had seen Velkari soldiers use only among themselves, something I had never once seen extended to a human before that night. "Thank you," she said simply, "for coming for us, even after we mocked what you carried. You'd have done the same," I said, "once you understood." "Perhaps," she said, "but you did it before understanding was forced upon you. That is a different kind of strength entirely." I thought about that as I walked back to my quarters that night, the rifle still resting against my shoulder, its weight familiar and constant in a way that nothing else on this outpost, or on any world I had ever set foot on, quite managed to match. It was not the most advanced weapon in the sector, it never would be, but it had done exactly what it was built to do, in exactly the moment it mattered most, and that was worth more than any amount of humming blue light or advanced targeting software. I cleaned it carefully that night, the way I always did, checking each component with the same patient attention my grandfather had taught me years before I ever imagined leaving Earth behind. Outside my window, the mountains of Perrin's Reach stood dark against the stars, the Hollow somewhere among them still holding whatever secrets remained after the day's encounter. Tomorrow there would be more questions, more meetings, more careful renegotiation of assumptions that had shaped this outpost's understanding of strength and capability. But tonight, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a weapon that had never once let me down, resting once again within reach beside my bed, ready for whatever came next. 3 weeks after the Hollow, a transport ship I did not recognize landed at Outpost Kestrel without warning, and the moment its ramp lowered, I understood that the quiet routine we had settled back into was about to end. The visitor was a Velkari official named Consul Brenilar, dressed in formal robes far removed from the practical armor worn by soldiers like Dessa Rowe, and he came flanked by 2 aides who carried themselves with the stiff precision of people used to important rooms. Colonel Ashby met them at the landing pad, and within an hour, Word had spread through the outpost that the consul had come specifically to speak with me. I met him in the same briefing hall where Threll Voss had once mocked my rifle, across the same table where I now sat facing a man whose rank placed him well above anyone else stationed on Kestrel. "Miss Fenwick," Consul Ilar said, folding his hands together on the table. "Your actions in the Hollow have not stayed contained to this outpost. Reports have reached the Velkari Assembly. There is considerable interest in understanding how a single human, using equipment our own engineers considered primitive, succeeded where an elite unit failed." "I only did what needed doing," I said. "Commander Rowe and Van Kesh helped bring themselves home just as much as I did." "Modesty is admirable," the consul said, "but it does not change the facts under review. The Assembly has commissioned a study into environmental zones across several colonized systems, places where mineral interference or similar conditions might compromise standard equipment the way the Hollow compromised ours. We believe there may be more such places than anyone previously accounted for." Threll Voss, seated beside me now rather than at the head of the table, leaned forward slightly. "The consul is here to propose something, Fenwick. Explain it to her directly if you would." Consul Ilar nodded. "We would like to establish a training program, drawing on human expertise with mechanical, low-technology equipment, to prepare specialized units for operations in environments where our advanced systems cannot be trusted. We believe you would be well suited to help design and lead the early stages of that program." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over carefully. 3 weeks earlier, I had been a technician whose weapon was treated as a joke in this very room. Now an official from the highest levels of Velkari government was asking me to help reshape how an entire military approached the limits of its own technology. "I'd want it to go both ways," I said finally. "Not just teaching your soldiers to use simpler equipment when advanced systems fail. I want human personnel included properly in planning from the start, not brought in as an afterthought once something goes wrong. If this program happens, it happens as a partnership, not a lesson handed down from people who finally noticed we had something worth teaching." The consul exchanged a brief glance with Threll Voss, who gave a small, approving nod. "That condition is acceptable," Consul Ilar said. "More than acceptable. I suspect it is precisely the shift in thinking the Assembly needs to hear directly from someone who earned the right to demand it." Over the following weeks, the outpost changed in ways both large and small. A section of the vehicle bay was converted into a training space, and soldiers who had once walked past me with barely a glance now showed up asking questions about weapon maintenance, about reading terrain without relying on scanners, about the patience required to wait for a clean shot instead of relying on rapid, overwhelming firepower. Dessa Rowe attended every session personally, and though her energy rifle remained her primary weapon, she asked me to teach her the basics of mechanical firearms with the same seriousness she once reserved only for Velkari combat doctrine. Van Kesh recovered fully from his injuries, though a long scar remained along his side as a permanent reminder of the Hollow. He requested, once he was fit for duty again, to be assigned to the new training program rather than returning immediately to frontline Ember Guard operations, a decision that surprised everyone, except perhaps me. Some experiences change a person's understanding of what strength actually means, and Van had lived through exactly that kind of change firsthand. Not everyone adjusted easily. A handful of officers grumbled quietly about wasted time spent learning outdated equipment, insisting the Hollow had been an unusual exception rather than a sign of any broader weakness. I did not argue with them directly. I simply kept teaching, kept training, and trusted that time and evidence would do more to change minds than any argument I could make in a briefing hall. That evidence arrived sooner than expected. 6 weeks after the Hollow, a distress signal reached Kestrel from a mining colony on a neighboring moon, one built atop deposits rich in a mineral compound similar to what saturated the Hollow's valley floors. A structural collapse had trapped several workers deep underground, in tunnels where the same interference that had crippled the Ember Guard's equipment now threatened to cripple any rescue effort relying on standard scanning or communication technology. I volunteered for the rescue mission without hesitation, and this time, nobody in the command center laughed when I picked up my rifle and pack. Dessa Rowe volunteered alongside me, along with 2 soldiers from the new training program who had spent the past 6 weeks learning exactly the kind of skills this mission would demand. The tunnels beneath that mining colony were nothing like the Hollow, no ambush waiting in the darkness, no coordinated predators guarding a hidden nest. But the principle held true regardless. Where advanced scanners failed against the mineral interference, careful observation and mechanical tools succeeded. We found the trapped miners using nothing more sophisticated than sound, patience, and a methodical search pattern I had learned decades earlier during training exercises meant for an entirely different kind of world. All 4 miners came home alive that day, and the report that followed made its way back to Consul Ilar's office within a week, cited as clear proof that the lessons drawn from the Hollow extended far beyond a single unfortunate encounter in a single dangerous valley. By the time autumn came to Perrin's Reach, marked more by shifting light through the dome's filtered atmosphere than any real change in temperature, the training program had grown from a handful of curious soldiers into a formal division, staffed by both human and Velkari personnel working side by side. Threlvos, who had once dismissed my rifle as something belonging in a display case, now kept a modest display of his own near his office, a small collection of Earth firearms sent from Human Command as a gesture of goodwill, each one labeled not as an antique, but as a testament to a philosophy the Velkari were only beginning to fully understand. I still carried my own rifle everywhere I went, its stock a little more worn now, its metal carrying a few new scratches from the mining tunnels, alongside the older marks from years of use before I ever left Earth. Younger human recruits arriving at Kestrel sometimes looked at it the way the Velkari officers once had, with a flicker of doubt, wondering why anyone would choose something so simple when more advanced options existed. I answered them the same way every time, standing in the training bay with a room full of soldiers watching, some human, some Velkari, all of them slowly learning the same lesson the Hollow had taught me the hard way. It's not about choosing the simple option because it's better in every situation, I told them. It's about understanding that no single kind of strength works everywhere all the time. The moment you forget that, the moment you assume your most advanced tool will always be enough, that's the moment something will find the gap in your confidence and use it against you. I thought sometimes about Cade Oren, the young officer whose laughter had been among the first I heard mocking my rifle, and whose life had been the price paid for a lesson that arrived too late to save him. I made sure his name was included in every training session, not as a warning meant to frighten new recruits, but as a reminder of exactly what complacency could cost, no matter how advanced the technology backing it happened to be. Dessa Rowe and I remained close after that, an unlikely friendship built in the aftermath of shared danger, forged in a cavern neither of us had expected to walk out of when the day began. She told me once, months later, that the moment she saw me step into that cavern alone, rifle raised, moving with a calm confidence she had not expected from someone she had dismissed the night before, was the moment she understood that respect earned through evidence would always outweigh respect assumed through reputation. I did not disagree. The rifle that had once been mocked across a briefing hall table now hung, framed and honored, in a place of respect within Kestrel's main hall, not as a relic retired from service, but as a working symbol of a lesson the entire outpost had learned together. Beneath it, a simple plaque carried words I had chosen myself, words that captured everything the Hollow, the mining tunnels, and every quiet training session since had taught anyone willing to listen. Strength is not measured only by what a weapon can do under perfect conditions. It is measured by what remains reliable when everything else has failed. I still walk those mountain paths on quiet evenings, rifle slung over my shoulder out of habit as much as necessity, watching the fog gather low over the distant hollow where 5 creatures had once guarded their nest against a threat they never expected to face. The valley remained dangerous, marked now on every map with careful warnings, but it no longer held the same power to surprise anyone who understood, finally, that not every problem could be solved by the most advanced tool available. Some problems required something older, something simpler, something that did not need permission from anything but the steady hands of the person who carried it. And on Outpost Kestrel, months after the laughter had first echoed through that briefing hall, everyone who mattered had finally learned exactly why that old Earth rifle deserved every bit of the respect it had earned the hard way.